The initiative is a victim advocacy nonprofit. We're statewide. And I'll talk a little bit more about our services and our specialty at the end of this presentation. So stick around and we can talk all about what we do and how we can all work together and support each other. So today we're going to be talking about gender and sexuality, but I think it's really important to kind of start out by saying some names of some of the people that we have lost, specifically Black trans people. This list is a short list of some of the people that were killed in 2020. I actually have not had the chance to update this list yet in 2021. So this was actually taken from the first 6 months of 2020. So I'm going to read some of these names out loud. The picture on the screen is of Tony McDade, who was killed by Tallahassee police in May of 2020. Some other names, we have Nina Pop, Monica Diamond, Laylene Kubalet Polanco, Malaysia Booker, Beloved Slater, Ashanti Carmen, Bailey Reeves, and many more. You can see a longer list of these names in the handout. I'll put that in the chat again in a minute for folks that joined after I sent that. But I just think it's really important to start this conversation kind of recognizing the gravity of the situation. All right, so today we're going to be covering kind of an introduction, some big picture framing for why are we having this conversation. We're going to talk about some key concepts, some common barriers and best practices that you all can use in your work and in your organization. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some intersecting history of disability justice and queer history, because I think that's very cool, and the movements have a lot in common, which is pretty neat. And then we'll end by talking some more about the initiative and the work that we do. All right, so I like to start every presentation with some group agreements. We definitely already touched on confidentiality, but I love questions. So please practice curiosity. Put all your questions, any and all of them, in the chat. And I will try my best to answer, at least address, or point you in the right direction. But gender and sexuality is a topic that there are lots of questions about it, and that's totally fine. And that's what this training is here for. So please ask your questions. With that, we're going to try and remain respectful with the understanding that none of us are perfect, right? None of us know everything already. That's the point of this training. So we want to make sure that we are trying our best to be respectful and recognizing that if we get something wrong, that's totally fine. And it might just be me saying, hey, actually, the way to ask this question is using this language, and then I'll get to your question. And that's totally fine. We also want to make sure that we're holding space for discomfort. A lot of the content that we're going to be covering today might be new to some people, and that's totally fine. And I also think it's really important to recognize that discomfort actually means that we're learning, and it means we're kind of addressing some of the things that we thought we were comfortable with in the past. So that's a good thing, and I expect for us to sit with some discomfort today. And then also making sure that we know the difference between discomfort and then having like an actual mental health trigger or something that is really actually negatively impacting us. So making sure that you're taking care of yourself throughout this whole presentation. We are going to be talking about abuse and different identities. So make sure that you are taking care of yourself. If you need to step away, if you need to go off camera, rejoin the meeting, that is totally fine with me. I just want to make sure that everybody is safe and comfortable in this space. We want to also try and speak from our own experiences. So I am going to be speaking from a personal experience place, as I'm a bisexual woman, and so I'm going to be speaking from that place. And if you all have personal things that you would like to share, that's totally fine. Just we want to make sure that we're speaking from our own experience and not trying to project on what someone else's experience might be. And then lastly, I have this quote by Mia Mingus. Mia Mingus is a transformative justice and disability justice activist. She is very cool. So if you get a chance to Google her, I highly recommend it. But she says, we need each other to end violence. And I think that's just a really beautiful way to start this conversation, recognizing that we're all in this together and we can all help in our effort to end violence, which is why we're all here, right? All right. Okay, so here on the screen are some various gender and sexual identities. You may have seen some of these before, maybe not. That's totally fine. I want to put this list up here on the screen just to say that I am not going to be defining all of these. And there are a couple of reasons for that. It's a little bit different than maybe what you were expecting from a gender and sexuality 101 training. But the reason for that is that, first of all, there is really no way that I could cover every single gender or sexual identity out there in the world. That would be a useless effort. There are so many. And I think the really important part of learning about gender and sexuality is learning that even if we don't understand or have a definition for somebody else's identity, it doesn't mean that they are less deserving of respect. So even if you don't understand the specifics of whatever gender or sexual identity somebody has or is telling you about, that's totally okay. I want us to get comfortable being uncomfortable and not knowing everything, because there's no way we would ever know everything about gender and sexuality anyways. So I just think it's really important to kind of go into this with that expectation. That said, on the handout, which I will put in the chat again now, there are definitions of all of these. So as we kind of go through this presentation and as we learn more, please feel free to ask specific questions if you have a question about any of these identities. All right. So I think it's really important that we kind of frame this conversation in systemic oppression. So we're not just thinking about people's individual identities. What we're actually doing is thinking about a group of people that have been historically marginalized by systems of oppression that work against them. So I'm sure you all have heard a definition of oppression before, but I'm just going to read this one. So oppression is a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group memberships and operates either intentionally or unintentionally on individual, institutional, and cultural levels. So some examples of oppression would be things like racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism. There are tons and tons of examples of different types of oppression. And the big point that I want to make with this slide is that systems of oppression or systems of power, what they're usually doing is looking at a person's body and mind. Like, how do we look at a person and decide if they have value, representation, or greater life chances? So that's really what all of these systems of power or systems of oppression are doing, is thinking about how do we decide who matters or who has greater life chances. And I'm curious, has anybody heard of the term intersectionality before? Just head nods. A couple head yeses, a couple no's. That's awesome. I like having a, a variety in the group. So intersectionality, I'm going to way oversimplify it because it's a pretty big concept that people spend entire PhDs on. But to way oversimplify, intersectionality is basically just the idea that people experience compounded effects of these different systems based on the different aspects of their identities. So if you as an individual have a few different historically, systemically oppressed identities, then you're going to experience each one of those all together. There's no way to kind of tear apart the different aspects of our own identities. So for example, this idea was invented to describe the really unique experience of being a Black woman. So a Black woman is going to experience racism, but she's going to experience it differently than a Black man would. And she's going to experience sexism, but she's going to experience sexism differently than a white woman would. Does that kind of make sense to folks? Okay. And I love this quote by Audre Lorde. She says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So again, there's no way to like tear apart these different parts of what makes us individuals, right? And I think it's important to point out too that movements that are led by the most marginalized people and that address these interlocking systems of oppression are usually the most powerful and successful social movements. Any questions about this slide? Check the chat here.
We had a quick question if the word queer is not a derogatory or negative term.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that question. Um, it is a really generational difference. To be honest, a lot of older people definitely have the associations with queer as a slur, um, which we definitely want to respect. So we don't want to ever like put that term on someone if they don't want it for themselves. That's totally fine. For younger generations, it is what we call a reclaimed term. So it's something that we as a queer community have taken and said, actually, that's our word. We're going to use that however we want to, and we're going to use that to define ourselves in a positive way. So generally, it is not a negative term anymore, but we want to respect that for folks that do have that association, that we want to respect that. That's totally okay, and we're not going to force anybody to identify with that word. Does that answer your question, Charlotte? Okay. Great question. All right. So, kind of another big context giving slide for a lot of this presentation is the idea of colonization, which some of us are probably like, why are we talking about colonization when we're talking about gender and sexuality? And the reason is that colonization actually had a huge impact on gender and sexuality. So, colonization, just to give you a quick definition, if this is not a familiar word to you, colonization is a system of domination and exploitation. It's not usually a single event wherein one country invades and takes control of another country. So many, many places have been colonized, including Turtle Island, which is actually the indigenous name for North America, where we are now. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because we have a concept called the coloniality of gender. And that basically means that the dominant gender system that we are all familiar with in the US, so the gender binary, how there are men and there are women, and that men and women are opposite from each other, that's actually a pretty recent idea. That is an idea that was really actually pretty forcibly imposed on a lot of other places by the dominant culture. So, by Western European culture, really imposed that on the places that we colonized, so including North America. That gender system was not natural or native to a lot of these places. So the point of that is that there is a really lengthy, rich, vibrant history of Indigenous gender and sexual norms that existed way before the West or Europe had any impact on a lot of these different places. So even though some of these words like lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, trans, non-binary, we'll talk all about those, but the point is that all of these different identities have always existed. There have always been people that don't fit into that dominant narrative, even if that language is new to you or new to us as kind of Western European descendants. I also think it's important to point out that colonization impacts people with disabilities, Black and Indigenous people of color, and many other marginalized groups. So it's definitely not something that is only impacting people with diverse genders and sexualities, but it impacts lots and lots of different groups of people. All right. So I'm also going to talk just very briefly about ableism. And I know, again, we're like, okay, why are we talking about ableism? I thought we were talking about gender. But ableism is basically the practices and dominant attitudes in society that devalue and limit the potential of persons with disabilities. So you can think about it as the discrimination against disabled people. And the reason why I bring it up in this context, and I'll keep bringing it up throughout this conversation, is because we know that 1/3 of queer people have disabilities. So if we are going to be talking about gender and sexuality, we are already automatically talking about disabled people also. So again, I'm going to go back to that idea of intersectionality and how all of these different experiences are going to combine and work together to impact how somebody experiences their life. So if we know that 1/3 of the queer community has disabilities, then we know that 1/3 of the queer community is impacted by heterosexism and homophobia and ableism, and that they are going to have a very unique experience in the world as a disabled queer person versus an able-bodied queer person. All right. So let's look at some statistics. So 1 in 20 Americans identify as LGBTQ plus, and I think that number is actually much higher, especially as we go and look at younger and younger generations. That number is just going up. 1 in 5 Americans have a disability. And actually, I need to update this slide. The CDC just updated it. It's 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. And over 1 in 3 LGBTQ plus Americans have a disability. So again, if we're talking about one group, we are definitely talking about both. So I think there are a lot of different reasons for why some of these numbers are the way that they are. Like, why are there so many disabled queer people? And some of these reasons are that LGBTQ plus people tend to experience higher rates of disability because of things like lack of inclusive health care. So you're not getting preventative care, so you're having some other health issues that you're not getting addressed. Lack of inclusive employment opportunities. So again, that's tied to healthcare. Housing access is absolutely tied. Like if you are homeless, you're probably going to have some health issues from sleeping outside all the time, right? As well as really high rates of interpersonal and institutional violence. So disabilities that might come from having physical injuries. We also know that a lot of diverse gender and sexualities were actually considered mental illnesses until very recently. So thinking about how like conversion therapy was legal in Colorado until 2019. So if we're thinking about why that rate of disability might be higher in this community, we have to be thinking about how that identity itself was considered a disability until very recently. Check the chat here. What does queer mean as I'm using it? Yeah, great question. Oh, that was a private question, but the question was, can you tell us what queer means as you are using it? Yes, so queer is a umbrella term. So basically, I am using it to refer to anybody who has a diverse gender or sexual identity. So if you are not straight and not cis, and we'll talk about that word in a minute, but if you are not kind of this like norm or the standard, then you might fall under that queer umbrella. So that's how I use it. I use it interchangeably with the LGBTQ plus community. It's a lot faster to say than that. So that's really the only reason I use that, but it just means the same thing. Great question. All right. So I think this is our last framing slide before we jump into some details, but I want us to think about what it means to be accessible. So again, going back to disability, but thinking about that for any group of people that has historically been pushed out of spaces, right? So what does it mean for us to not just be inclusive? Like, yeah, we serve LGBTQ plus people, or yeah, we serve disabled people, of course, checkbox. But what does that actually mean for us to try and make our practices, our relationships, our organizations like truly accessible? And I'm going to quote Mia Mingus. I quoted her at the beginning, but she says this about access. She says, access for the sake of access is not necessarily revolutionary, but access for the sake of connection justice, solidarity, and love has the power to transform. And I love that quote. I just think it's a really great way to kind of guide ourselves in like why are you at this training? Like what are we trying to accomplish, right? We're trying to have those things like connection, justice, solidarity and love. That's really what our goal is, right? When we're trying to be inclusive of different communities, whether that's the queer community or the disabled community or any other community. We really are wanting to form those connections and have these like solidarity and love as our guiding principles, right? So that's how I want us to think about the rest of this presentation. Okay, so let's get into some of these key concepts. Okay, I want to hear from you all. If you want to put it in the chat, I'm curious, how familiar are you already with LGBTQ plus communities? Is this something maybe you've taken a class on? Maybe you yourself are queer. Maybe you have a family member who's part of this community or a friend. Maybe you have coworkers. I'd love to hear just a little bit from you all about how familiar you are at this point. And while folks are typing, I am going to say the reason that I ask this question is because I am not the only expert on this community. Like, I know that you all have various levels of familiarity, especially if you are personally part of the community. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we can all learn from each other, including me. So if you have something else that you want to add or say at any point in this presentation, please jump in and put it in the chat because we can all learn from each other. Okay, we've got family members, friends, don't know very many, friends, my daughter, I'm part of it, yeah, child, this is great. So we have really quite a big mixture, it sounds like. Very familiar, lots of friends, family, parent of a child who's gender curious, awesome, gender identity center, gay friends, fairly familiar, comfortable with non-cis sexual orientations, still learning how to navigate gender. Yeah, great. Friends, awesome. 2 boys, part of the community, 1 son, trans, 1 who's gay. Have participated in pride marches, sister, friends, coworkers. This is great. Yeah, I love this. The community is so big. Great. Thank you all for sharing. Okay. So I want to go into talking a little bit about how is this related to the work that we do in violence. So I want to hold space and recognize that these statistics are really heavy. So I'm just going to read them and we can all sit with that together. So the average life expectancy of trans women of color is 35 years old. And that's compared to, I think it's like 78 for cis white women around there. 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women have experienced intimate partner violence. 1 in 4 LGBTQ plus people have experienced employment discrimination in the past 5 years. 85% of transgender homicide victims were misgendered in initial reports of their death, and that's including Tony McDade from the first slide. Do you remember that picture? He was consistently misgendered, which means that they used the wrong gender to describe him for, I think it was a few weeks at least, when there were news articles and things like that. 92% of LGBTQ plus youth say that they hear negative messages about being queer, and they are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. And finally, 1 in 5 transgender people have been denied healthcare coverage because of their transgender identity. Good. Okay. So this is a really important issue. It is definitely impacting the work that we do. So here are some of the terms that we're going to cover. My hope in going over these specific terms instead of individual identities is that you will be able to use what you know about these broader terms to kind of interpret specific identities. So hopefully this will make it easier to understand all of those specifics because there are so many specific identities, but these terms should hopefully help in understanding whatever somebody presents you with. So yeah, like it says here, context giving definitions. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Has anybody heard of the term sex assigned at birth before? Here, seeing some yeses, some nos. Okay, so sex assigned at birth is basically the way that a baby pops out and we say, oh, it's a girl or oh, it's a boy. And we are basing that decision usually on things like physical anatomy and karyotyping, which is where you look at genes and chromosomes. Um, Usually it is defined as male, female, or intersex, tends to be the biggest ones. Intersex is a term, again, it's an umbrella term. So that means that it covers a lot of different varieties. But basically, it is the natural variation in sex characteristics outside of the typical binary of male versus female bodies. So intersex is actually a very common phenomena. There is not actually that strong of a binary between man versus woman, like when you're looking at physical anatomy. And I think this is super interesting because I think a lot of people at this point in 2021 are like, okay, I kind of can wrap my head around sexuality and gender, but physically we have men and we have women. And that's actually not true. It's not scientifically true. It's not scientifically true in the biological community anymore. We actually definitely recognize that there is a spectrum of bodies and sex characteristics. This concept was very confusing to me at first. I think it is something that is, yeah, definitely one of the most confusing parts about this whole conversation. So I'm going to tell you an anecdote that really kind of made it clear to me. So there was a research study going on, and they were, don't know what they were studying, but they were using lab rats. And they had the lab rats split into male lab rats and female lab rats. And they were having a lot of trouble actually understanding the data that they were getting. They couldn't figure out why it wasn't making sense, but it was not matching these two categories that they had separated these animals into. And so somebody suggested, okay, what if we actually get a little bit more detailed and look at more than just like genitals on these animals to decide what their gender is. And so what they ended up doing is splitting the rats, like recategorizing them instead of into two categories, into I think they had five. So again, thinking about a spectrum of different physical experiences. And all of a sudden, their data started to make sense when they had more categories than just two. And that just blew my mind, right? Like that just makes it make sense. Why do we have this dichotomy when we know that there are lots of people that don't fit into it? Just physically, it just doesn't. It's not real. Check the chat here, see if we have questions. Yes, yeah. So, part of this term, sex assigned at birth, is recognizing that even though we have these categories that we generally use in our society, that they have been assigned to somebody, that it is a decision that was made by somebody else. And usually a doctor, but that it's somebody else making a decision for a teeny tiny baby. Um, and it also acknowledges that that decision can sometimes be made really violently. So there is actually a really horrific, pretty prominent practice of genital mutilation that happens in lots of major hospitals all over the country, where if a baby is born with ambiguous anatomy, a doctor will make a decision, sometimes without even talking to the parents about this decision, unfortunately. But the doctor will make a decision about how to alter the natural anatomy of this newborn in order to fit into one of these boxes. And usually that is done by taking away tissue because that is easier to do than to add tissue. So if there's physical anatomy that's a little bit ambiguous, they usually will physically mutilate that child in order to make them fit into one of these boxes. So if you're curious about this, there's lots of information. If you want to Google intersex activism, you can find lots of really great information about this issue and about some of the work that's been going on to get rid of that practice. All right, any questions about sex assigned at birth? Okay. Just a quick example to use myself as an example. I was sex assigned at birth female. So that's how you would use that term. All right, so let's talk about gender identity. So, gender identity is one's internal sense of being male, female, neither of those, both, or something else. Every single person has a gender identity, including you. So, my gender identity, I identify as a woman. Um, so, just some more language around gender identity. When we use the prefix cis, that means same. So a cisgender person is somebody who identifies with the same gender or sex that was assigned to them at birth. So again, to use myself as an example, I am a cisgender woman because I was assigned female at birth, and as I have grown up, I know that I identify as a woman, so I am a cisgender woman because it's the same as I was assigned at birth. For a transgender person, that prefix trans means different. Um, so their sex assigned at birth is different than their gender identity, or they're not necessarily the same. Um, so the only way that we can know someone else's gender identity is to ask and to listen to them. So there's a saying by a sex educator. Their name is Erica Hart. If you want to look them up, I love them a lot. But they say that gender is in your brain. And that doesn't mean that it's fake or it's silly or anything like that, but it is your internal sense of who you are as a person. It is inside of you. So gender is in your brain. Any questions about gender identity? Okay. All right. So pronouns usually come up when we're talking about somebody's gender identity, though it's not necessarily connected, but oftentimes it is. So pronouns are what people, every single person uses pronouns. It's what we use to refer to ourselves and to each other. So you'll see in my bio or in my name, I have in parentheses she, hers, so that you know that when you're referring to me, you should use she, hers pronouns. So, her presentation was really terrible today, or it was really great. But that's an example of how you would use my pronouns. A really common misconception is that they, them pronouns are really new, which is not true. It's just not true. They, them pronouns have been used as a singular pronoun for many, many centuries. It can actually be traced back to Old English. So it is just as grammatically correct as any other pronouns to use for a person, a single person. The big point that I want to make about pronouns is that there is no way to know what someone's pronouns are just by looking at them or by hearing their voice. So, what I want to encourage us to do is think about pronouns as an extension of somebody's name. That is the easiest way to remember it. So, just like how you don't know my name unless I tell you what my name is, you also don't know my pronouns unless I tell you what they are. So, for example, if I was walking down the street, you would have no way of looking at me and knowing that my name was Zoe, unless I had a name tag on, right? But you also would have no way of knowing what my pronouns are or what my gender identity is just by looking at me, unless I had a name tag or a little addendum to my name on Zoom, right? Or in my email signature.
Zoe,
Yeah,
could you go through and pronounce some of the more complicated ones?
yes, I can. Um, all right, so I'll just go through, and I want to also note that this is not the complete list of pronouns. And that's again that same point that even if you don't understand what someone else's pronouns are, it's really important to try your best to respect it and use it, even if you don't understand it. So we have he, him, his, they, them, theirs, sie, ihr, his, or sie, ihr, ears. See, I even struggle. Like I teach this presentation and it is still confusing for me, and that's okay. As long as I'm trying, right? That's what matters. The ones with the X's are they, them, theirs, and then she, her, hers. And they're usually written like that to describe the different tenses, just the where they fit in the like grammatical structure. Check the chat here. Some generations say yes, ma'am, yes, sir. Is there another way to be very polite? Um, that one is one that is tricky. Yeah, I have had a hard time finding, because just like you're saying, Charlotte, yeah, I worked in retail for a really long time, and it was like ingrained in us that if someone enters the store, you say, hello, ma'am, or hello, sir, or you answer the phone that way. And it's actually the way I want us to try and think about it is it's actually kind of impolite to assume that we know how somebody identifies. Um, that's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head like an individual replacement. So the last point on this slide is that it is actually a privilege to not have to worry about which pronoun someone is going to use for you based on how they perceive you. So for myself, again, to use myself as an example, if I am walking down the street, it is pretty safe for me to assume that everyone who sees me is going to use the correct pronouns for me because I look the way that somebody is going to expect someone who uses she, hers pronouns to look. And so that's just not something that I have to think about. It doesn't take up any space in my day to day. But for people who maybe have different pronouns, or maybe they don't present their gender in a way that is expected of them, it can actually cause a lot of stress to constantly be having to think about how you're perceived by other people and if other people are going to respect your identity or not. So it's a privilege to not have to think about that. Um, we have a question. I wonder how you might ask kids for their pronouns. They might not even know what you're talking about. As a substitute teacher, I misgendered a student and was really embarrassed, as was the student. I do not know how to ask for pronouns or how to call on a student without assuming pronouns. Yes, great question. I will go to my next slide here. So we are going to talk about it, but I want to use that as a way to ask you all what feels like the biggest barrier to talking about your pronouns or to talking about other people's pronouns. And I have some examples on the slide, but maybe it's something different. Is it something that you're afraid of maybe looking silly or being seen as too politically correct? Maybe you're worried that someone will like, ask you to explain and you won't know how to answer. Maybe you don't want to out yourself. Maybe this is a totally new concept and you've never heard of it before, and that's totally fine. Or maybe you don't want to hear someone be harmful or dismissive. Or maybe not. Maybe you're super excited. What do you think? Too old. Why not just use the names? That's a great point. Rachel, that is one of the safest ways to just avoid this whole thing. Names are usually very safe. Any other thoughts? Why is this tricky? It's just hard to know if you're in a safe space to talk about pronouns. Yeah, I worry that people won't know what I'm talking about. It's a new concept. I've never needed to use it before. Yeah. Yeah, those are all super valid concerns. So let's talk about it. How do we do it? So I think the big point here is that yes, it is going to be uncomfortable, especially if it's not something that you have a lot of practice with. Like I do this presentation all the time, and so I'm used to it. But if this is something that's new to you, it is definitely going to be uncomfortable. But the point that I want to make is that someone else's safety is actually more important than your discomfort. So, wanting to kind of feel out, is this an unsafe situation? Or am I just uncomfortable? And recognizing that that line is going to be different for everybody, especially if we think about folks that maybe use pronouns that aren't she, hers, or he, his. Like if I used they, them pronouns, maybe there are some spaces where it would be unsafe for me to say that, and that that's okay. So we want to make sure that we're kind of having this consciousness of when something is unsafe versus uncomfortable. And who is it unsafe for? Is it unsafe for you to ask, or is it uncomfortable for you to ask? Is it unsafe for somebody else to disclose, or is it uncomfortable? Because that happens to me all the time. Sometimes I ask for people's pronouns, and somebody who's never heard of this concept before is very uncomfortable by it, but they're not unsafe. Me asking a cisgender person who uses the pronouns that most people expect them to use is not going to be unsafe by being asked to question like why they want to assume everybody knows what their pronouns are. You know what I mean? So asking and correctly using another person's pronouns is a really basic way to show respect for their gender identity. So yes, it is hard, but it's a really basic, simple way to show them that you care and that you're trying. Even if you mess up, to know that you're trying is really important. When someone is misgendered, it can actually make them feel really invalidated, dismissed, alienated, or dysphoric. Dysphoria is a physical feeling in a person's body that comes from this like really, really intense discomfort based on the way that other people are misperceiving you. Got lots of chats here. Let me check them. Okay. Okay. Worry. Um, Okay, my 8th grade daughter had a teacher at school ask students for pronouns, and then a friend on the bus was dismissing it as overboard and unnecessary. So I could see people hearing comments like that and not wanting to talk about it. Yeah, for sure. Worry about offending someone, like how could you not know? That's a huge one. That's probably the biggest one that I come across when I'm talking to a group of people who have never been asked to think about it before. It's usually, well, I'm obviously a woman. Like, why would you assume that I'm not? And really, the point is that I'm trying not to assume about anybody. And that's a good thing. We don't want to make assumptions about people. Get tripped up because the binary is ingrained. Yeah, how and when do you bring this up when you meet someone new? I think, again, the best rule is to use people's pronouns like you use people's names. So, hi, I'm Zoe. I use she, hers pronouns. What's your name? What are your pronouns? Super easy. Just think about it as like an extension of a person's name. Just like we said before, there's no way to know unless you ask. So just ask. It's not weird to ask someone's name, right? Yeah. I've noticed by introducing myself, it encourages those who are comfortable to share theirs too. Yeah. Are some people offended if you ask about pronouns? Yeah, they are. And again, it goes back to like thinking about, okay, is this a question of safety for me, or is it uncomfortable to ask? And then trying to figure it out. Is asking invasive? That's a great question. I would say no. What I think is important is this second to last bullet point here. Do not pick and choose whose pronouns you ask. So the whole point of this is that we are saying, okay, I know that gender is complicated and I'm not going to make any assumptions about anybody. And that's really polite to do is to not make assumptions about somebody. And so as long as you are like projecting that this is kind of a standard thing that I'm sharing my pronouns, if you want to share yours, please do. And then the last point here, do not require anyone to disclose their pronouns if they don't want to. So if somebody does not feel comfortable sharing their pronouns, totally fine. And that could be a safety issue. A lot of folks will use different pronouns in different situations. So maybe when they're around their friends, they use they, them pronouns, but maybe they're not safe at home to use they, them pronouns. Maybe they have to use the pronouns that match the gender they were assigned at birth around their parents for safety. So you want to honor and respect that people can make these choices all by themselves, like, and it's totally fine. But I think the important part is that if you're comfortable doing it yourself, as somebody said, Felice said a couple of comments ago, that it encourages other people to share theirs too. And it shows somebody, even if they're not comfortable disclosing their pronouns to you, they know in the back of their mind that you are a safe person. And that's really what we're trying to do with this, is make ourselves as safe as possible for people to be themselves, especially if you're working with the general public, which I know you all are. So it can be really important to like include on your email signature or things like that. It just shows people that this is something that you care about and that you're thinking about. These are great questions. So here are some examples on the right of how to ask. I think the safest one is just always just use yourself. If maybe you're not ready to ask other people for theirs, that's totally fine. Just, my name is Zoe. I use she, hers pronouns. What's your name? And that's totally fine. And if they know what that is and want to share, they will. I want to respect your identity. Can I ask your pronouns? What pronouns do you use? Do you want to share your pronouns with me? But again, going back to, you don't want to pick and choose who you ask. Like, you don't want to look at a whole room of people and say, oh, you look like your gender is a little weird. Let me ask you. That is rude to do. You want to ask everybody. Great, great questions. All right, so let's talk about trans identities. All right, so the umbrella term that we use for this community is transgender or trans. You also might see it written as trans plus. It's an umbrella term that describes anybody whose gender identity, so gender is in your brain, gender is who you are, differs from the sex that you were assigned at birth based on your physical body. Identifying as trans is something that an individual always decides for themselves. Being trans does not depend on any type of criteria like surgery or hormones or even presenting your gender in a certain way. Someone is not more or less trans because of any of their personal choices about their body. So I think a lot of people assume that to be trans, you have to have had surgery or you have to be taking hormones. And that's not true. Somebody can be trans just because their gender is different from what someone told them they were when they were born. That is the only criteria that anyone has to meet to be trans. And I love this quote. This quote is really beautiful, and I think it speaks to this idea that we have kind of in our society. Trans people have been visible for a while now, but I think it has been really under this pretty restrictive narrative that in order to be trans, you have to be miserable, and then you do something, and then your body is different, and now you're happy. And that's really reductive. Like, that is just not how we want. Like, would you like to feel that way, or that you have to fit that specific set of experiences? And it's not true. So here's an alternative in this quote. They say, I dream of a world where the thing that binds trans folks together is no longer shared trauma, but a liberated and joyful experience of the infinity of ways to be a human being on the earth. That's a beautiful quote. And I think it gets to this like much deeper and more meaningful like way of thinking about gender, right? Like, it's not, we don't want to be separating people into boxes. We want to be celebrating how different we all are. There's nothing wrong with that. Last thing on this slide, just a note about language. It was very, very common, probably in the last 10 or 20 years, to see the word transgendered with an ED at the end. We do not want to use that word. That word is disrespectful for a few reasons, but the big one is that it implies that something happened to somebody to make them trans, that it's kind of like an add-on to their identity. which it's not. It's just who you are. If your gender is different from what someone said it was when you were born, then you can be trans. And so we don't want to say transgendered. We only want to say trans or transgender. And the same for cis as well. You can say cis or cisgender, but you don't want to say I'm cisgendered. I'm cisgender. I am a cisgender woman, or someone else might be a transgender woman. All right. So for this slide, I want to talk about the gender binary. So the gender binary, like I said before, is the dominant assumption that there are men and there are women and that these are opposites from each other, or male and female, and that these are opposites. Gender itself is not a social construct, but the gender binary is. So, gender is something that's very real. Like I said, gender is in your brain, it's who you are on the inside. That's really real. But this assumption that there are only two options and that they're opposite from each other, that is a social construct. Like, that is something that has been imposed on people from outside. So, when we talk about the gender binary, and trans identities, some trans people do identify inside the gender binary. So, for example, trans men or trans women. So, this is maybe somebody who was assigned sex at birth male, but they know that they are a woman. So, again, they fit inside that gender binary. They are one of those two options. It's just not the one that they were assigned at birth. So, that is a binary trans identity. The important part here is that trans women are women and trans men are men. So if you are talking about men, you are automatically including trans men because gender doesn't have anything to do with your anatomy, right? Like when we were on that slide about gender identity, it's all who you are on the inside. Gender is in your brain. Um, there are also some people who don't identify inside the gender binary at all. So this might be somebody who is non-binary or gender fluid or bigender or agender or gender queer. There are lots and lots of different words or definitions or identities, but anyone that is kind of rejecting those two choices, who says, well, why do I have to choose between just these two? I don't feel like a man, or I don't feel like a woman. I just am, or my gender is both, or I kind of fluctuate between one and the other, or I am somewhere in between, or maybe I reject the idea of gender entirely, and that would be somebody who's agender. But again, any of those identities is different from what that person was assigned at birth. And so that person can fall under that trans umbrella. Check the chat for some questions here. If someone identifies as non-binary, would they be considered transgender? That's a great question. It comes down to personal preference. They definitely have the option to. Again, so thinking about the definition of trans is just if your gender identity is different from what the doctor yelled when you popped out. So yes, if you are non-binary, that's different. The doctor probably did not yell, "Oh my gosh, they're non-binary." So yes, that person does have the option, but it's not required. So again, this whole thing is all about how people have choice and agency to describe themselves however fits best for them. So maybe that person feels an affinity for what they were assigned at birth, and that's totally fine. And maybe they don't identify as trans. Yeah, so it depends. Okay. All right. All right, so let's talk about gender expression. So, gender expression is the way that a person chooses to present their gender to others. So, gender identity is in your brain. Gender expression or gender presentation is what you show to other people. So that might be the way that you dress or speak or act or shave or put on your makeup. Typically, gender expression has been referred to as masculine or feminine or androgynous. But those aren't the only options, right? So many transgender people tried to make their gender expression, which is how they look, match their gender identity, which is who they are, rather than the sex that was assigned to them at birth. But again, that is not required, right? Somebody is not more or less trans because of the way that they dress. So if we want to think about how someone, anybody, whether you're trans or cis, anybody at all, can play with the way that you present your gender. So, for example, somebody who is maybe gender non-conforming, they might or might not be transgender. So, for example, a cisgender man, so somebody who was assigned male at birth and knows that they are a man on the inside, that matches, so they're a cisgender man, that man can totally wear a skirt. And that doesn't make him any less of a man, right? Or maybe he could wear fingernail polish or eyeliner or something like that. And he's no less of a man for doing that. Just like how a cisgender woman could wear a suit and still be a cisgender woman. Gender expression or presentation really doesn't mean anything about your gender identity. And that goes for trans people too. So we don't want to force somebody who's trans to have to present their gender in a specific way for us to believe that they are trans. So just like how a cisgender man can wear a skirt, a transgender man can also wear a skirt, and he is still just as much of a man for doing that. And the big point here is that clothes, makeup, speech, all of that does not have a gender. It's just it's just a skirt. It's just eyeliner. It does not have an inherent gender, right? Anybody can play with these things however they want to, and it doesn't say anything about who you are. A lot of people use it to like have clues about who you are, right? But it's not like a requirement. Can you define gender nonconforming? Yeah. So gender nonconforming is an identity label that basically just means that the way that you experience your gender in your brain or the way that you express your gender externally is not standard. It's not conforming to that gender binary. So anytime I wear a suit or decide not to wear makeup, or if I wanted to cut my hair short, that would be gender nonconforming of me to do, right? Because that's not expected for a cisgender woman to do those things. Okay. All right, so let's talk about sexual orientation. So, sexual orientation is a person's physical, romantic, emotional, aesthetic, and or something else form of attraction to other people. So if we want to think about how gender is the way that you relate to yourself, your sexuality is the way that you relate to other people. So we call this the split attraction model. The split attraction model basically just says that these different things, physical, romantic, emotional, aesthetic, those things don't all have to match. So, for example, I know that's kind of weird, but for example, somebody could maybe be physically attracted to a different gender from themselves. So they might be heterosexual physically, but maybe they're romantically attracted to the same gender. That's complicated. People are complicated, right? We have all sorts of different types of desires and experiences. And so the split attraction model says that we can kind of mix and match. We can find language to describe our own unique experiences within any of these different types of attraction. So, some examples: might be bisexual, but aromantic. So that would mean that this person is sexually attracted to multiple genders, so not just the same and not just different from themselves. So they're sexually attracted to lots of different types of people, but maybe they're aromantic, which means that they don't have any sort of like romantic desire. Maybe they aren't interested in any type of relationship, no matter what your gender is. So that's an example of a split attraction model. Or maybe somebody is is gay, and so their sexual orientation is gay, and so they are exclusively attracted to people of the same gender as they are, but maybe they're biromantic, and so they are romantically attracted to all types of people. So you can kind of mix and match, which I think is really cool and beautiful thinking about this model and how we don't even need to limit ourselves when we describe sexual orientation.
We had a
Um,
couple of comments in the chats, wondering if the previous slide or the previous point was considered labeling.
yeah, I mean, I think labeling can be really important for lots of different people for lots of different reasoning. So the point here is, of course, that we're not trying to force any type of label on anybody at all. But labeling can be really important for somebody personally. So again, to just like use myself as an example, I'm bisexual, and using that label for myself is really important for a couple of different reasons. And then the next question here is, why is it anyone's business? It's not. I don't have to tell you what those reasons are, but they're important to me. And so I like that label for myself. It helps me find other people that have similar experiences to me and relate to them. So it's important for that, but it's definitely not like required. Um, I have a hard time using any pronouns as I don't want that person to feel like I only care about their orientation and not who they are. I want people to know me for what I do, not what my sexuality is. Yeah, I think that this question is bringing up an important distinction. So, pronouns are something that every single person uses. Everyone uses pronouns, whether you kind of like it or not. We are making assumptions about what pronouns somebody uses all the time. So, oh my gosh, someone left their backpack. They left their backpack. That's a pronoun. Or if I know whose backpack it is, oh my gosh, Zoe left her backpack. So that's what pronouns are. It really has to do with how we relate to ourselves and each other. Sexuality is definitely something that can be personal. Gender identity is definitely something that can be as personal as you want it to be. You do not have to share that with anybody. You don't have to ask what someone else's sexuality is, but using pronouns does not say anything about somebody's sexuality or necessarily even their gender identity. Yeah, I also think it's important to provide a safe platform for kiddos that we work with and might be struggling. Mhm. Yeah, especially because we know that kids who are part of this community have much higher rates of violence, much higher rates of sexual assault. And so it's important for us to recognize that we probably are serving a bigger percentage of this population than the general public, specifically in the work that we do. So it's really about kind of like signaling to the general world that this is something that we care about. This is something you've had a training on, and that you'll listen if somebody tells you what their pronouns are, and that you're going to try your best. Does that kind of answer that question? I know it's tricky. All of these things for a very long time have been mushed together. And so it's only in the last 10, 15, 20 years that we've been able to talk about these things openly, right? And so being able to come up with these distinctions. An important note about sexual orientation in Western cultures, so this is kind of the standard for us where we are now, gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same thing. Um, so a trans person, so trans is a gender thing, that is a gender identity. Trans people can be straight, bisexual, gay, lesbian, asexual, any type of sexual orientation, just like cisgender people. So, for example, a trans woman who is exclusively attracted to other women would probably identify as a lesbian, just like if a cisgender woman identified as a lesbian. Because one thing that has occurred to me is that a lot of people, CASA might ask a teen if they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, assuming that they are straight. The language might be better to ask them if they're dating someone. Or maybe you have good suggestions for using neutral language, talking to teens. Yeah. So I'll use myself as an example again. I'm bisexual. My partner is a man, but I use the term partner for him instead of boyfriend because I think that it is much more inclusive and it honors the fact that I could be with a woman or a non-binary person. So my partner, I'm not assuming, and I don't want other people to assume his gender based on me saying the word boyfriend. So I would recommend partner, or if you're dating someone. Yeah, that's a great, really thoughtful question. All right. Any other questions while we're here on sexual orientation? I want to keep moving because we only have 15 minutes left. Okay. All right. So this is the traditional gender model. So this is what we all grew up with. This is really dominant in our culture. I'll use myself as an example. The traditional gender model assumes that Zoe is assigned sex at birth female. She identifies as a woman, presents feminine, will fall in love with a man who presents masculine. So this leads to expectations about how these two genders should behave, or gender roles. This model assumes that each piece necessarily informs the others and that any type of variation from that is unnatural. So assigned sex at birth leads to your gender identity, which leads to your gender expression, which leads to your sexual orientation. That's kind of our dominant model. I also think it's really important to point out that gender roles vary by culture and are often informed by white supremacy and colonization. That little bubble could be a whole dissertation. Can't touch on that much more than that, but I think it's important to point out. All right, so question for you all, if you want to put in the chat, how often do your clients, your friends, your community members express that the ideas associated with the traditional gender model or gender roles negatively impact them? Is that something that you've seen? Have gender roles negatively impacted you or someone you know? So some examples while you all are typing, because I'm sure you all have examples, but some examples might be being pressured to marry someone. That's a gender expectation. Or being forced or expected to cook or clean. Concerns that you might be outed without your consent. Harassment about your gender expression. We have a yes, we have a never, yes. Um, Things like being expected to man up. Like how often have you heard that phrase or heard the phrase like men don't cry? Things like that. As a full-time working mom and mother, my husband does most of the housework, and I struggle often with not feeling like a good woman or a good mother. Yeah, that's definitely because of kind of these expectations about what specific genders are supposed to do. Gossip kiddos, family, friends, all have found this to be true. Yeah, I think the point with this is that gender roles have so many impacts on us, right? They really have a huge range of effects on tons and tons of different things. Yeah, my family didn't take my relationship seriously until we were married. Struggle with gender roles, especially around cleaning. That's super, super common. Again, I'll use myself as an example. Even in a relationship where we are both very anti-gender roles, we still fall into these habits, right? I think someone said a while ago in the chat that it's very ingrained. It's a lot of hard work to fight against them, right? Yeah. All right. So as kind of an alternative, I want to present the authentic gender model is what it's called. This model acknowledges that, again, taking myself, Zoe's sex assigned at birth could be male, female, intersex, or maybe even something else that we don't have the language for. That their gender identity, gender expression, and sexuality can be anything, and that all of those things can change over time, and that all of those pieces are distinct from each other. So, the point that I want to make with this is that there is absolutely room in this model for somebody whose experiences are described by the traditional gender model. There's nothing wrong with identifying and moving through your life the way that we generally assume people do. That's totally fine. If you are sex assigned at birth female and you are a woman and you present your gender feminine and you marry a man, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And that can absolutely fit into this authentic gender model, which just expands that, right? It allows more room to actually authentically describe everybody's experience. We're not trying to force anything on anybody. The way that the traditional gender model does have specific expectations, the authentic gender model doesn't have those expectations. But if you have those experiences that match the traditional, that's totally fine. That there's plenty of room for everybody in the authentic gender model. Check the chat here. Yes, I hear all the time about how boys will be boys, or how women are supposed to be doing the housework, cooking, and cleaning. One of my aunts didn't have kids until she was in her 40s, and people were always asking her when she's going to have kids. Yeah, that's definitely part of the traditional gender model. All right, so let's talk about what we can do to help this community. This is a picture of Audre Lorde, who I quoted at the beginning. She described herself as a Black feminist, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, which is just such a wonderful description of yourself. And she wrote on the board, "Women are powerful and dangerous." All right. So this section is split up into 3 slides. I know there's a lot of text on here, but each slide is going to represent kind of a different tier. So we have interpersonal, which is this first slide, and that's going to be the way that we interact with each other just one-on-one. This says individuals interacting with each other. And then the next slide is going to be environmental. So this is the way that our environment is. And then we have institutional or organizational. So that's things like policies. All right, so I'm just going to go through these. So for interpersonal or attitudinal, some common issues that this community faces in accessing victim services are lack of acceptance and affirmation, homophobic or transphobic comments and actions from staff or other clients. So maybe there's homophobia happening between people sitting in your office, or like if you are working in a safe house, that's where we see a lot of this, is other people who are using the services can also be harmful. Fear of being misgendered or your partner being misgendered. Someone asked a great question about that earlier. Gendered assumptions of violence. That one is a huge one. And I most often work with adults, so you'll have to think about how this affects kids. But if you are thinking about how we are assuming that maybe it's a man that perpetrated the harm, why are we assuming that? We're assuming that because we have a culture that expects men to be violent. And if it's a woman perpetrating the harm, that doesn't make it any less harmful just because she's a woman. So dismissal or minimization of the abuse or the harm. So for example, this is something we see a lot in domestic violence, that if it's a same gender couple, police will oftentimes say that it was mutual abuse or it was a fair fight, or that femme violence, so two women or feminine presenting people, are not taken seriously. Like we often hear that, oh, that's just a cat fight or something like that, when it's really just an abusive relationship. Um, the expectation that it's the client's responsibility to educate you about their identity, culture, or experiences of oppression. And that's not just for this community, that's for anybody who has an identity that has some of these histories. So some ways that we can combat this. We don't want to assume somebody's gender, sexuality, or pronouns on the phone or by looking at them. So again, the only way to know any of those things is by asking or listening. We want to avoid gendered language like sir or ma'am. Normalize introducing yourself with your pronouns or asking pronouns. Like, is that something that you guys have on your intake or that you all have on your intake? See, I just did it myself. I just used a gendered term. It's hard. It's really hard. Connect clients with appropriate queer organizations and services if that's something they need. The big one here is that every identity is valid, whether or not you understand it. So you don't need to understand the intricacies of how someone has sex or who they have sex with or what their gender identity is. You don't need to understand it to support that person and believe that person. Um, so the good tip for that is to always listen for the language that people use to describe themselves and then reflect that back to them. So whenever I'm on the phone with a client, I'm always listening for stuff like that. And if I hear it, I just make a little note. You can learn about these things in advance. So taking trainings like this is great. Ask questions, maybe not so much with kids, but it's not a bad thing to ask these questions. You just want to be prepared for that person to not want to spend their time and energy educating you. So be prepared to have to Google it. We also want to make sure that we're never outing somebody, especially with kids. I think it's important that if we are working with them specifically and we know that maybe they're non binary or trans, it's important to have a conversation with them because maybe their parents don't know that. And you don't want to be the one to tell their parents if that's not safe. We want to affirm that gender is not a binary and that gender and sexuality are diverse and fluid. All right. So, environmental. So, a lot of these have to do with thinking back to some of those statistics about how, if you're part of this community or any historically marginalized community, you are going to have less access to time, money, resources, things like that. So, some barriers could be financial access, time commitments, distance. We actually have a really large rural population of queer people. Disability and accessibility. Again, a third of LGBTQ plus people are disabled. Gendered bathrooms can be a huge issue, or even signage or posters not representing a client's identities. So, some best practices, you want to make services free or sliding scale, which I think you all probably are free. Provide meals or snacks in your office. Maybe somebody is running around trying to meet with you all in between two shifts at their two different jobs. So maybe they don't have time to eat because they went to see you today. So provide some snacks in your office. You could provide transportation or offer to meet people where they are. Disability accessibility is super important. You could provide childcare, gender inclusive bathrooms, and even inclusive signage. So make sure that you're not using like posters or things that kind of portray an image of who can access your services. Basically, if you increase access in these really tangible, meaningful ways, you are automatically going to encourage participation from all types of marginalized groups of people. So the things on this slide are really, really common to any group of people that has had historically difficult time accessing services. All right. And then lastly, here we have institutional or organizational. So these are big picture things. So sometimes organizations will set aside gender and sexuality as irrelevant, but it's not irrelevant. That's part of who you are. You can't just like ignore your gender or sexuality when you reach out for help. Policies that aren't inclusive of diverse genders, organizations lacking a knowledge on historical or ongoing oppression, reductive or binary options on paperwork. So you want to take a look at how do you ask for your client's gender? Are there options to describe lots of different gender identities? Even like having a narrow single issue focus when serving LGBTQ plus communities. So assuming that like the only issue facing the queer community is gender or is marriage equality. I haven't mentioned marriage equality this whole presentation, right? Gendered language in trainings, staff or volunteer onboarding, posters. So when you are training new staff, are all of your examples a man perpetrating abuse against a woman? Mix it up. We want to make sure that we're not kind of reinforcing these binary assumptions. And then non-representative staff or volunteers, like are we looking and seeking out diverse gender and sexuality staff members? Incomplete, non-existent, or unenforced harassment policies. That one is super applicable to like safe houses. So some solutions, you want to be gender inclusive in your policies. You want to have inclusive options for describing gender and pronouns on paperwork. You want to offer, encourage, and require continuing education, just like this one. Good job. Try and cut out your gendered language from everyday work environments. So a minute ago, I caught myself saying you guys. That is super ingrained in me. I think it's a Midwestern thing. I have been trying to say y'all more, which is much more fun anyways, right? Hire and collaborate with queer and trans people, especially disabled, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And you want to make sure you have policies outlining what to do if there is gender or sexuality discrimination. All right. I'm going to skip this, but I'll send out the slides. Some really cool history, like Stonewall has some cool disability history in it. The AIDS movement is a really wonderful example of this intersection. Disability justice, some local figures, Carrie Ann Lucas, Google her. She was a really, really incredible person. All right, so just last thing, just want to make sure you all know who we are. So like I said, we do victim advocacy. We specialize in working with survivors with disabilities, but we serve anybody who has experienced any type of abuse. So that makes us a little bit different from some agencies that only work with domestic violence or sexual assault. We also will work with family violence, human trafficking, stalking, financial abuse, caregiver, and elder abuse as well. So anybody who's experienced any type of abuse is a great referral for our advocacy. We specialize in disabilities, but every single person can benefit from a disability-centered approach. So that's not a requirement for services. We are gender inclusive, and we also have a bilingual bicultural Spanish advocacy program. So we're a really great referral for monolingual Spanish speakers. And we also have a rural program. So anybody in the state of Colorado who has experienced any type of abuse is a great referral for us. I also want to make sure you all know that we are here as technical assistants for you all. So if you're working on a case and you don't want to refer the client to have another advocate, but you maybe have a question about disability or about gender, how do I ask this person about their disability? How do I navigate, like, do you have any referrals for LGBTQ plus organizations? That's a great reason to shoot me an email. So anything like that, we are here to help you. Great. And then lastly, I am just going to put in the chat a quick survey link. We are a nonprofit and we are funded by people who like to see surveys. So if you could just take 30 seconds to fill this out for me, it would be really, really helpful for us and for continuing to be able to offer these trainings for free for the community. Great. Got some thank yous. You are welcome. Yeah, some difficult discussions. Yeah. Any last questions? I have some more time, so I can stick around if anyone wants to keep chatting.
I will go ahead and say this is the official ending of the presentation. So for those of you who need to log off, I completely understand. But Zoe, if you have a couple minutes and want to hang out, I'd love that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and just literally 30 seconds on that survey. It's very helpful for me. Any lingering questions from anybody? I know I threw so much information at you all, so I understand if you are just digesting for a little while.
No,
I did have
go ahead.
Oh, I did have the question about trans women in sports. I know this has been a pretty political topic in the last couple months, especially with Biden coming in. And I, as inclusive as I want to be, I still have a hard time with this one, especially in full contact sports. And I was wondering if you could comment on that and give maybe a fresh perspective.
Yeah, sure. I think the most important thing in any sort of political conversation about trans identities is to remember that trans men are men and trans women are women. There is tons and tons of physical variance in cisgender people also, right? Like I am very, very weak.
Mhm.
I do not want to be playing any sort of sport at all, even with other cisgender women. And I think the same is true of men also. There is such a huge variety and natural spectrum of bodies. Like no matter what, no matter where you cut it or where you define that line, trans men are men and trans women